To comprehend a narrative such as this, one must acknowledge a bygone era when humanity hunted whales with relentless indiscrimination, pushing these magnificent creatures to the brink of extinction. It was a period of profound upheaval. From the late 18th century, throughout the 19th, and continuing into the 20th century, individuals embarked upon vast ocean voyages specifically to hunt whales. In contemporary times, society stands in stark opposition to such practices, widely condemning whale hunting. Yet, there was a historical juncture when this activity held immense importance for people, primarily because the whale was a vital source of oil. Whale oil was an indispensable commodity in daily life. Before the advent of kerosene and petroleum, whale oil illuminated public spaces, fueling the oil lamps that lit cities. It was also extensively used to lubricate machinery, and the blubber itself found application in numerous other ways. This relentless pursuit of a valuable resource led to the near eradication of these enormous, peaceful, friendly, and highly intelligent cetaceans. During that period, however, whaling was an integral and accepted part of human endeavor. Furthermore, it was an astonishingly perilous undertaking. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, whale hunting was executed entirely by hand. Unlike the 20th century, which saw the introduction of powerful harpoons propelled by gunpowder or compressed air, earlier methods were entirely manual. A ship would set sail, venturing deep into the ocean's most remote reaches, seeking out the vast pods of whales. These creatures, mammals by nature, were social beings, communicating amongst themselves and exhibiting complex family lives. Despite the inherent tragedy, whalers would pursue them to these distant domains. Upon locating a group of whales, the main vessel would halt, and small wooden oar-powered boats, often called dories, would be lowered. These smaller crafts would then meticulously track the whale pod, and harpoons would be hurled by hand, embedding themselves into the whale's head. The harpooned whale would immediately bolt, fleeing at tremendous speed, dragging the small boat behind it. This presented an extraordinary hazard, as whales could lash out with their tails, breach from the water, or engage in many other unpredictable behaviors. These men were incredibly exposed. Safety equipment, thermal survival suits, GPS, or buoys were non-existent. They ventured into the vast ocean with minimal protection, relying solely on their raw courage and strength. Many of these individuals were perceived as having little to lose. For many, alternative employment was scarce, their identity firmly rooted as whalers, a profession that, while perilous, offered good wages. However, this entire endeavor meant that year after year, ships were lost in myriad ways. A wooden vessel weighing 300 tons, navigating a vast ocean prone to storms, was an easy target. Furthermore, distances became interminable, relying solely on sail propulsion, with winds often unpredictable, sometimes favorable, sometimes not. Thus, depending on the navigator, the helmsman, and the captain, a ship could be becalmed for weeks or steadily advance with a following wind. Yet tales of such perils were commonplace. When a ship departed a port, it was highly probable it would not return, or if it did, its fate might be sealed on the subsequent voyage. Few whaling ships and even fewer crews endured for extended periods. The return of an entire crew was considered a triumph, as the act of descending into those small boats, known as dories, exposed them to every conceivable danger. A sudden wave could capsize the small craft, leaving everyone adrift, or a collision with another boat dragged by a harpooned whale could pull them at full speed to the ocean depths. Anything was possible. One of the primary hubs for whaling crews and ships was Nantucket, an island off the coast of Massachusetts in the United States. From this bustling port, whalers would return, their holds brimming with barrels of whale oil, which was then distributed to major cities. This was an exceptionally lucrative trade. A single large whale could yield as much as 100 barrels of oil, offering a stark illustration of the immense sacrifice involved and the sheer number of animals that had to be hunted to fill a ship's hold. It was indeed a terrible reality. Fortunately, humanity has evolved, and today there are international restrictions on whaling, though some nations regrettably disregard them. In that historical period, however, Nantucket thrived with whaling ships, their crews, adventurers, and individuals seeking income and a way of life. Many of these people were illiterate, hiring themselves out for a few coins. Life aboard a ship offered a means of sustenance, or, often, death. Among these vessels was the Essex. The Essex was not notably large, yet it was a well-constructed ship, crafted from premium timber. Nevertheless, it was an aging vessel. By the 1820s, the Essex had already been afloat for over 2 decades, having been built around 1798 and commencing its voyages in 1799. Wooden ships of that era were not typically expected to serve for such extended periods, particularly without modern technology. Despite its age, it earned a reputation as a lucky ship, or Lucky Lucy, consistently returning from its expeditions with valuable cargo. Compared to other whaling ships, the Essex was relatively small, carrying only 4 whaling boats, the dories, whereas other vessels might carry 6 or 8. It possessed only 4, with an additional spare stored in the hold, underscoring its modest size. Its displacement was estimated at around 240 tons. To put this into perspective, a large contemporary container ship can carry up to 550,000 tons, making the Essex seem like a mere nutshell by comparison. Its masts and full complement of sails must have presented a beautiful spectacle in port. However, this grandeur was purely aesthetic. Once at sea, the ship's vulnerability became acutely apparent. The Essex had indeed enjoyed a run of good fortune, and on its previous voyage, or perhaps the one before, its captain had returned with remarkable success. Among the crew on that penultimate journey was none other than George Pollard Jr., whose exceptional performance led to his promotion to captain of the Essex. The ship itself had undergone thorough inspection, receiving various enhancements and significant repairs. Thus, in 1819, when a new expedition was planned, the vessel was deemed to be in excellent condition. Its new captain, Pollard, was remarkably young, merely 29 years old, an unusual age for a ship's commander. His first mate, Owen Chase, was also relatively youthful. The remainder of the crew typically consisted of 19 other men, bringing the total complement to 21. These were small crews, a necessity given that such ships often embarked on incredibly long voyages, sometimes spending up to 2 years at sea. A compact crew was essential for prolonged survival, even with stops at various ports for resupply. Provisions had to be managed meticulously, a task made impossible with a large crew. Therefore, the Essex sailed with 21 men, the captain, his first mate, and 19 crew members. It was an old ship with a young captain, yet it boasted an excellent, highly regarded crew. With everything prepared, they set sail on August 12, 1819, from Nantucket, Massachusetts, on the Atlantic coast. Their destination was the distant waters of the South Pacific, effectively the other side of the world. The Essex was to undertake a formidable journey, passing through the Gulf of Mexico, near the island of Cuba, then proceeding along the Central American coast. From there, it would continue sailing south along the entire Atlantic coast of South America, ultimately reaching Cape Horn, one of the most treacherous navigational points globally. After rounding Cape Horn, the ship would then commence its voyage into the South Pacific. This expedition was estimated to last 2.5 years. Those aboard understood they would not see their families, parents, or children for at least that long, if not longer. Occasionally, a whaler, having secured a full cargo, might proceed to an intermediate port, discharge its substantial load of whale oil barrels, and immediately put back to sea without returning to its home port of Nantucket. This practice meant voyages could stretch on, extending to 3 or even 4 years. Such prolonged expeditions, of course, promised considerable wealth, assuming the crew ever returned. The Essex embarked with this ambitious goal. Its crew was also somewhat unusual, as unlike other trades or vessels, Whalers had no qualms about employing mixed crews, including men of African descent, both formerly enslaved and free-born, alongside white sailors. This diversity was not an issue. Among the 21 crew members of the Essex, 7 were either formerly enslaved or free-born individuals of African descent. These were excellent whale hunters, possessing great strength, and within the ship's confines, camaraderie transcended racial distinctions. The color of one's skin was irrelevant. What truly mattered was the ability to navigate and perform the arduous tasks at hand. And so, this remarkable story begins. The Essex commenced its southward journey, but upon entering the Gulf waters, troubles immediately arose. The ship was caught in a sudden, violent storm that tossed it relentlessly from side to side, threatening to capsize the vessel. Fortunately, Captain Pollard reacted with swift decisiveness. He managed to adjust the ballast, attempt to lower the sails, and bring some order to the chaos, but the ship was left severely listing. One of the dories, the small boats used for whaling, was also badly damaged. The ship itself lost several sails and remained heavily tilted. Yet, the captain was resolute in his decision not to return to Nantucket, as this would mean losing an enormous amount of time on an already lengthy voyage. Through the arduous efforts of the crew, they managed to right the ship, fully regain its buoyancy, make rapid repairs, and continue sailing south. Fortunately, after that initial ordeal, no further storms assailed them, at least not in the Caribbean waters. The real challenge emerged when they were unexpectedly beset by a desperate calm, following that tremendous storm in the open sea. Suddenly, for 5 weeks, everything was still. The Essex drifted gently on the water, barely stirring. This was not a propitious sign. Any sailor, any whaling captain, understood it as a grave omen. Captain Pollard recognized it as a harbinger of ill fortune. First a storm, then this unnerving stillness. Perhaps the most unsettling event of all occurred when, in the midst of that dreadful calm, an enormous bird, a gigantic albatross, settled upon one of the ship's masts. More than one sailor shook their head, acknowledging a perceived premonition of their fate. Captain Pollard, however, dismissed such superstitions, urging everyone to continue their work. The youngest crew member was merely 14 years old, while the oldest was in his 40s. Thus, the crew comprised strong, relatively young individuals. Following that peculiar calm, the wind eventually returned, and the Essex resumed its agile and swift journey. It navigated around the Argentine region, reaching the very end of the world, then rounded the treacherous Cape Horn. They made a stop at a point along the way for crucial resupply and repairs before pressing onward. A second port of call was made in what is now Ecuador, where one of the crew members, an individual of African descent, deserted. Overwhelmed by fear and convinced by the dire omens, this man simply gathered his belongings and disembarked in a foreign country, a strange colony where he did not even speak the language. He abandoned the voyage, intending to board the first available ship. From there, the Essex continued its journey. The crew managed to capture a few whales, but soon it became apparent that the waters were depleted. Nothing remained. Months had passed at sea. By January 20th, 1820, approximately 5 months after departing Nantucket and having rounded Cape Horn, they had secured only a small number of whales. It was clear that the warm Pacific waters in this region had been overhunted, leaving them barren of whales. While in port, they learned from other whalers that abundant whales could be found hundreds of miles further offshore, beyond the Galapagos Islands. Armed with this intelligence, they prepared to set sail on a journey of thousands of kilometers to reach the promised hunting grounds. It was a complex and perilous voyage, largely because it ventured into the middle of nowhere. Should anything go awry, there would be no port of call, no safe haven. Nevertheless, the allure of the hunt beckoned. After leaving what is now Ecuador, they sailed directly towards the Galapagos. There, they paused to gather provisions, capturing hundreds of tortoises and replenishing their water supply. Tragically, they were forced to abandon the island before fully provisioning. Due to a moment of foolishness, one crew member, attempting a prank, ignited a torch and some dry vegetation while others were collecting tortoises. This act sparked an inferno of such magnitude that it devastated the island's entire ecosystem, wiping out species and wildlife. The fire became so extensive that they were forced to flee, severely limiting the amount of provisions they could acquire. Back on board, they had no choice but to continue their journey. The tortoises themselves were a living larder. They were not immediately cooked but kept alive, roaming freely, some even in the ship's lower sections where a seawater ballast system existed. When food was required, a tortoise would be sacrificed. They could have captured many more, had it not been for that senseless act. The fact remained that they had to continue sailing until they finally approached the designated point where countless whales were expected to be found. However, upon reaching this location, it was already September 1820, meaning more than a year had passed at sea, and their cargo hold was still far from full with oil. In this particular area, the situation was peculiar. They observed few whales, and then another issue arose. Typically, each dory carried 6 crew members. This arrangement meant 3 boats would be lowered to sea, while 3 crew members remained aboard the main ship to maintain its position, keep watch, and attend to any needs. But with 1 crew member having deserted, only 2 men would be left on board, creating a precarious situation. The crew waited expectantly when suddenly someone spotted a spout in the distance, one of those telltale plumes formed by a whale's breath. Immediately, one of the boats was lowered and sped towards the sighting. However, just as they neared the location where the whale's spout had been seen, the creature unexpectedly dove beneath the surface. It then resurfaced directly beneath the boat, delivering a powerful tail fluke that shattered the vessel. All the men were thrown into the water, but miraculously, they all survived. Another nearby dory quickly reached them, recovering the crew and returning them to the Essex. Yet again, this incident served as a grim omen. Things were clearly not going well. A couple of days later, perhaps things would take a turn. In the distance, numerous whale spouts were observed. The Essex began to maneuver into position, having already deployed its reserve boat, meaning 2 of the dories were already lost, leaving only 3. These remaining boats stood ready, and at the captain's signal, they would be lowered, and the men would row at full speed, commencing the grim work of the hunt. On November 20th, 1820, after a prolonged period in these waters, whales were again spotted in the distance. Immediately, the dories were launched and began to row towards them. However, no sooner had the first whale been harpooned than it bolted at tremendous speed, lashing out with its tail and striking one of the boats. The dory was damaged, though not sunk. The men in the boat, including First Mate Chase, managed to row back to the Essex. The other 2 dories had also successfully harpooned at least 2 whales, which were now dragging them away at great speed. It was a spectacle that would fray anyone's nerves. As these leviathans were harpooned, they surged with immense power, pulling the small boats across the water. Chase returned to the Essex, pulled alongside, and his damaged dory was hoisted aboard, turned upside down, and repairs began on deck. It was early morning. The wind was calm, and it was a sunny, pleasant day. Suddenly, one of the young men on deck reported to Chase that there was a strange whale in the distance, a very unusual, enormous white whale. Chase immediately recalled the stories. He had heard tales of such a whale, some calling it Mocha-Deek after sightings near Mocha Island. How peculiar! As they approached the ship's rail to get a better look, they could clearly discern that it was a colossal animal, gigantic, seemingly paused in the distance, observing them. Then, with sudden, incredible power, finning with immense force, the enormous creature launched itself against the Essex, striking it head-on on the port side. The impact was so forceful that the ship reeled from side to side, objects tumbling everywhere. Everyone on board was stunned. They had never witnessed anything like it. That animal must have measured at least 30 meters in length. It was a gigantic albino bull sperm whale. The creature seemed momentarily dazed, but moments later, before anyone could harpoon it from the ship, it turned and swam away at great speed. The Essex crew stood in bewildered surprise. What was this? But before they could fully process the event, the whale had turned again, now approaching with even greater speed and visibly enraged. This animal was clearly seeking vengeance. Some specialists suggest that the percussive sounds of the ongoing repairs attracted the animal. No, that was not the reality. This creature had been sighted elsewhere before. It was a known entity, recognized as a bull whale or bull whale, a guardian, one that accompanied its pod. It had undoubtedly identified the whalers as a threat. What they had not anticipated was that this animal would charge with such force and power, colliding head-on with the ship's bow, creating a massive hole. The whale's head penetrated the ship below the waterline, causing water to immediately rush in. Finally, the animal thrashed its tail, dislodged itself, and vanished into the distance. The Essex immediately began taking on water. One crew member rushed to the captain's cabin to retrieve his travel chest, containing navigational charts and instruments, and brought it to the deck. They hastily salvaged what they could from the holds as the ship rapidly listed. Observing this unfolding disaster from a distance, the other two dories, which had been engaged in hunting, cut their harpoon lines and returned at once. Upon their arrival, Captain Pollard was stunned. What on earth had happened? Suddenly, Chase leaned over the rail and exclaimed that a whale had rammed them. The damage was catastrophic and irreparable. The ship was rapidly sinking. Fortuitously, the calm weather aided them, allowing the vessel to remain afloat for 2 days. During this time, they managed to retrieve supplies from the holds and prepare the dories. These small boats, designed for speed in pursuit of whales, were ill-suited for long voyages. Therefore, extra planks were fastened to their sides to protect against waves and prevent water ingress. Improvised sails were fashioned from poles and spars, hoping the wind would aid them in reaching some distant destination. There were 3 boats in total, carrying 20 men, who were distributed among them. All available provisions and water were loaded, or at least as much as the small, unburdened boats could hold. After these desperate preparations, the Essex finally succumbed, sinking to the depths of the ocean. The paramount question was, where to go? They instinctively knew they had to sail towards land, seeking a point where they could disembark from the boats and find safety. These small crafts, however, would not withstand a storm. But there was a more immediate problem. They were approximately 2,000 nautical miles from the coast of Chile, adrift in 3 improvised small boats, resembling rudimentary sailboats, with meager provisions, in the vast expanse of the ocean. What could possibly go wrong? Nevertheless, they began to navigate. Captain Pollard, utilizing his navigation charts and instruments, had no difficulty in determining their position and setting a course. Chase also carried a set of charts and instruments. The third boat, however, possessed none of these, and was expected to follow the leading 2. Their situation was extraordinarily precarious, with every sign pointing to the fulfillment of the dire omens that had plagued their journey. Indeed, the crewman who deserted in Ecuador had claimed to have had disturbing dreams and premonitions. Of course, no one had heeded him then, and now they found themselves adrift. Well, not entirely adrift. They had navigational instruments and sails, and so their desperate journey commenced. The initial challenge was that a month passed with no land in sight. As they navigated these small boats across the vast sea, they unexpectedly discovered an island, an idyllic, deserted landmass, Henderson Island, part of the Pitcairn Archipelago, a British territory. While the island possessed a freshwater source, an internal stream, its primary drawback was a severe scarcity of provisions, wildlife, and resources of all kinds. Moreover, at high tide, the stream would become submerged below sea level, rendering it unusable for days until the tide receded. Captain Pollard, along with First Mate Chase, concluded that the island offered no sustainable means of survival, and thus they re-embarked in their boats. However, 3 of the crew members chose not to follow. They resolved to remain on Henderson Island, hoping that eventually a passing ship would discover them, aware that the island lay along a potential shipping route. The remaining 3 boats once again set out into the open sea. This decision was arguably one of the gravest, or perhaps simply a twist of fate. The ordeal at sea, however, was just beginning. First, the boats separated. One, lacking navigational charts, was completely lost and never found. The boats, commanded by Chase and Pollard, continued their harrowing journey, separating at times only to reunite later. As the days stretched into weeks, their meager provisions dwindled. Weakness began to claim lives. The first to perish succumbed to sheer exhaustion, debility, fatigue, and sunstroke, their bodies covered in sores from prolonged exposure to the sea. Following the old maritime tradition, the deceased was wrapped in their clothing, sewn up, and committed to the sea. When the second man died, the same ritual was observed, but when the third perished, a different, more desperate decision was made. They chose to consume him. They ate some of the viscera first, then other tissues, casting the remnants into the sea. Coincidentally, the occupants of the other boat arrived at the same grim conclusion. Hunger and exhaustion drove them to cannibalize their fallen comrades. Yet even this was not enough, and the days continued to pass. Soon, another died and was also consumed. Then, when no one else perished naturally in Captain Pollard's boat, they resorted to drawing lots. Indeed, they drew straws to determine who would die and be eaten. By a cruel twist of fate, it was a relative of Captain Pollard himself who drew the short straw. He stoically accepted his destiny, and in a subsequent lottery, another man was chosen to shoot him. He was shot and then consumed. Still, this desperate act offered only temporary respite, and the days continued to pass, hunger relentlessly gnawing at them. In the other boat, the same grim scenario unfolded. They, too, had consumed their shipmates. By February 1821, the small boats were still adrift at sea. On February 15th of that year, First Mate Chase's boat was discovered. It had been at sea for 89 days when another sailing vessel, the Indian, sighted the survivors. The scene they encountered was horrific, with clear evidence of human remains. Nevertheless, they were rescued and later transferred to another ship. The boat containing the remains of their deceased companions was lost in transit, having been tethered behind the Indian but detached during a squall. The survivors, though alive, were severely ravaged, their faces terribly burned by the sun. A living tragedy. Remarkably, Captain Pollard and his remaining crew were also found. Another whaler, the Dauphin, located them. The spectacle was even more disturbing when the Dauphin approached the small dory. A whaler drew near, shouting and calling out to the men. As they closed in, they realized there were only 2 individuals aboard, frantically gnawing on bones as if they were dogs fighting over a scrap. The crew of the Dauphin was so appalled by the sight of them fighting over human bones that they nearly sank them. Eventually, they were rescued, their identities confirmed, as Pollard was a known figure from Nantucket. They were recovered, and information was relayed about the 3 men who had stayed behind on the island, who, by chance, were found in good condition upon rescue. After being brought to Chile and recovering, they eventually returned to the United States. It had been a truly dreadful odyssey. Of the 21 men who had embarked on the Essex, only 8 returned. Most tragically, of all those who perished, only 2 had not been consumed. The rest of the deceased had been devoured. The fate of the lost boat remained a subject of persistent discussion. One might assume it simply vanished. However, some time later, a similar dory, resembling those of the Essex, was found. Inside, 3 skeletons were discovered, but they were incomplete, suggesting that the boat had likely also been cannibalized. This would imply that potentially 11 individuals had been consumed, though officially the count is cited as 7, with other accounts suggesting a higher number. Interestingly, no formal punishment was meted out at the time. Within the whaling community's working dynamics, the act of consuming a fellow human for survival was not considered a crime. So much so that in 1822 Pollard was again given command of a ship, but it quickly met with disaster and sank. He was given a second command, which also ended in loss. After these repeated misfortunes, Pollard never again set foot on a ship. He was branded Jonah, a harbinger of bad luck, and no one would hire him. Chase, however, continued his maritime career, sailing throughout his life and eventually commanding his own vessel. Other sailors returned to sea, while some did not, but the story would be recounted and retold, serving as inspiration. Indeed, Herman Melville drew upon the narrative he heard about the Essex when writing Moby Dick. Edgar Allan Poe, too, based the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket on the testimonies of cannibalism that surfaced at the time. Numerous other editions and texts also chronicled the events, and yes, the whale itself played a significant role. Moby was eventually hunted and killed in 1838. This enormous albino sperm whale was well known in the South Pacific regions, often accompanying whale pods and fiercely defending its family groups. For anyone who believes whales lack feelings or loyalties, they are mistaken. These are intelligent and emotional animals, and their mass slaughter was a profound tragedy. Yet, one must also acknowledge the men who embarked on these small ships were either extraordinarily brave or utterly desperate, for many of them would never again return to land.